The phalanx was a rectangular mass military formation, usually composed entirely of heavy infantry armed with spears, pikes, cuirasses, or similar weapons. The term is particularly used to describe the use of this formation in ancient Greek warfare, although the ancient Greek writers used it to also describe any massed infantry formation, regardless of its equipment, as does Arrian in his array against the Alans when he refers to his legions. In Greek texts, the phalanx may be deployed for battle, on the march, even camped, thus describing the mass of infantry or cavalry that would deploy in line during battle. They marched forward as one entity. The word phalanx is derived from the Greek word phalanges, meaning finger. The term itself, as used today, does not refer to a distinctive military unit or division but to the general formation of an army's troops. Thus a phalanx does not have a standard combat strength or composition but includes the total number of infantry, which is or will be deployed in action in a single phalanx formation. Many spear-armed troops historically fought in what might be termed phalanx-like formations. The word has come into use in common English to describe a group of people standing, or moving forward closely together. Cf. a phalanx of police. This article focuses on the use of the military phalanx formation in ancient Greece, the Hellenistic world, and other ancient states heavily influenced by Greek civilization. The earliest known depiction of a phalanx-like formation occurs in a Sumerian stela from the 25th century BC. Here the troops seem to have been equipped with spears, helmets, and large shields covering the whole body. Ancient Egyptian infantry were known to have employed similar formations. The first usage of the term phalanx comes from Homer's, used to describe hoplites fighting in an organized battle line. Homer used the term to differentiate the formation-based combat from the individual duels so often found in his poems. Historians have not arrived at a consensus about the relationship between the Greek formation and these predecessors of the hoplites. The principles of shield wall and spear hedge were almost universally known among the armies of major civilizations throughout history, and so the similarities may be related to convergent evolution instead of diffusion. Traditionally, historians date the origin of the hoplite phalanx of ancient Greece to the 8th century BC in Sparta, but this is under revision. It is perhaps more likely that the formation was devised in the 7th century BC after the introduction of the aspish by the city of Argos, which would have made the formation possible. This is further evidenced by the Chigivas, dated to 650 BC, identifying hoplites armed with aspish, spear and panoply. Another possible theory as to the birth of Greek phalanx warfare stems from the idea that some of the basic aspects of the phalanx were present in earlier times yet were not fully developed due to the lack of appropriate technology. Two of the basic strategies seen in earlier warfare include the principle of cohesion and the use of large groups of soldiers. This would suggest that the Greek phalanx was rather the culmination and perfection of a slowly developed idea which originated many years earlier. As weaponry and armor advanced through the years in different city-states, the phalanx became complex and effective. Overview. The hoplite phalanx of the archaic and classical periods in Greece was a formation in which the hoplites would line up in ranks in close order. The hoplites would lock their shields together, and the first few ranks of soldiers would project their spears out over the first rank of shields. The phalanx therefore presented a shield wall and a massive spear points to the enemy, making frontal assaults against it very difficult. It also allowed a higher proportion of the soldiers to be actively engaged in combat at a given time. Battles between two phalanxes usually took place in open, flat plains where it was easier to advance and stay in formation. Rough terrain or hilly regions would have made it difficult to maintain a steady line and would have defeated the purpose of employing the use of a phalanx. As a result, battles between Greek city-states would not take place in any possible location, nor would they be limited to sometimes obvious strategic points. Rather, many times, the two opposing sides would find the most suitable piece of land where the conflict could be settled. Mostly the battle ended with one of the two fighting sides fleeing to safety. The phalanx usually advanced at a walking pace, although it is possible that they picked up speed during the last several yards. One of the main reasons for this slow approach was to maintain formation. If the phalanx lost its shape as it approached the enemy, it would be rendered useless. If the hoplites of the phalanx were to pick up speed toward the latter part of the advance, it would have been for the purpose of gaining momentum against the enemy in the initial collision. Herodotus states, of the Greeks at the Battle of Marathon, that they were the first Greeks we know of to charge their enemy at a run. Many historians believe that this innovation was precipitated by their desire to minimize their losses from Persian archery. The opposing sides would collide, possibly shivering many of the spears of the row in front and killing the front part of the enemy army due to the bone-breaking collision of the start of the battle. The battle would then rely on the valor of the men in the front line, whilst those in the rear maintained forward pressure on the front ranks with their shields. When in combat, the whole formation would consistently press forward trying to break the enemy formation. Thus, when two phalanx formations engaged, the struggle essentially became a pushing match. This physical pushing match theory is the most widely accepted interpretation of the ancient sources. Historians such as Victor Davis Hanson point out that it is difficult to account for exceptionally deep phalanx formations unless they were necessary to facilitate the physical pushing depicted by this theory, as those behind the first two ranks could not take part in the actual spear thrusting. Yet it should be noted that no Greek art ever depicts anything like a phalanx pushing match, and this hypothesis is a product of educated speculation, rather than explicit testimony from contemporary sources. The Greek term for push was used in the same metaphorical manner as the English word is, and so cannot be said to necessarily describe a literal, physical push of the enemy, although it is possible that it did. In short, the hypothesis is far from being academically resolved. For instance, if Othismos were to accurately describe a physical pushing match, it would be logical to state that the deeper phalanx would always win an engagement, since the physical strength of individuals would not compensate for even one additional rank on the enemy side. However, there are numerous examples of shallow phalanxes holding off an opponent. For instance, at Delium in 424, the Athenian left flank, a formation 8 men deep, held off a formation of Thebans 25 deep without immediate collapse. It is difficult with the physical pushing model to imagine 8 men withstanding the pushing force of 25 opponents for a matter of seconds, let alone half the battle. Such arguments have led to a wave of counter-criticism to physical shoving theorists. Adrian Goldsworthy, in his article, The Othismos, Myths and Heresies, The Nature of Hoplite Battle, argues that the physical pushing match model does not fit with the average casualty figures of hoplite warfare, nor the practical realities of moving large formations of men in battle. This debate has yet to be resolved amongst scholars. Practical difficulties with this theory also include the fact that in a shoving match, an 8-foot spear is too long to fight effectively or even parry attacks. Spears enable a formation of men to keep their enemies at a distance, parry attacks aimed at them and their comrades, and give the necessary reach to strike multiple men in the opposite formation. A pushing match would put enemies so close together that a quick stabbing with a knife would kill the front row almost instantly. The crush of men would also prevent the formation from withdrawing or retreating, which would result in much higher casualties than is recorded. The speed at which this would occur would also end the battle very quickly, instead of prolonged battles lasting hours. Shields. Each individual hoplite carried his shield on the left arm, protecting not only himself but the soldier to the left. This meant that the men at the extreme right of the phalanx were only half protected. In battle, opposing phalanxes would exploit this weakness by attempting to overlap the enemy's right flank. It also meant that, in battle, a phalanx would tend to drift to the right. The most experienced hoplites were often placed on the right side of the phalanx, to avoid these problems. Some groups, such as the Spartans at Nemi, tried to use this phenomenon to their advantage. In this case, the phalanx would sacrifice its left side, which typically consisted of allied troops, in an effort to overtake the enemy from the flank. It is unlikely that this strategy worked very often, as it is not mentioned frequently in ancient Greek literature. There was a leader in each row of a phalanx, and a rear rank officer, the Argos, who kept order in the rear. The phalanx is thus an example of a military formation in which the individualistic elements of battle were suppressed for the good of the whole. The hoplites had to trust their neighbors to protect them, and be willing to protect their neighbors. A phalanx was thus only as strong as its weakest elements. The effectiveness of the phalanx therefore depended upon how well the hoplites could maintain this formation while in combat, and how well they could stand their ground, especially when engaged against another phalanx. For this reason, the formation was deliberately organized to group friends and family closely together, thus providing a psychological incentive to support one's fellows, and a disincentive through shame to panic or attempt to flee. The more disciplined and courageous the army, the more likely it was to win. Often engagements between the various city-states of Greece would be resolved by one side fleeing before the battle. The Greek word dynamis, the will to fight, expresses the drive that kept hoplites in formation. Now of those who dare, abiding one beside another, to advance to the close fray, and the foremost champions, fewer die, and they save the people in the rear. But in men that fear, all excellence is lost. No one could ever in words go through those several ills which befall a man, if he has been actuated by cowardice. For 'tis grievous to wound in the rear the back of a flying man in hostile war. Shameful too is a corpse lying low in the dust, wounded behind in the back by the point of a spear. Tiresias. The war songs of Tiresias, the phalanx of the ancient Macedonian kingdom and the later Hellenistic successor states, was a development of the hoplite phalanx. The Phalangites were armed with much longer spears, and less heavily armored. Since the sarissa was wielded two-handed, Phalangites carried much smaller shields that were strapped to their arms. Therefore, although a Macedonian phalanx would have formed up in a similar manner to the hoplite phalanx, it possessed very different tactical properties. With the extra spear length, up to 5 rows of Phalangites could project their weapon beyond the front rank, keeping the enemy troops at a greater distance. The Macedonian phalanx was much less able to form a shield wall, but the lengthened spears would have compensated for this. Such a phalanx formation also reduces the likelihood that battles would degenerate into a pushing match. Hoplite armament. Each hoplite provided his own equipment. The primary hoplite weapon was a spear around 2.4 meters in length called a dory. Although accounts of its length vary, it is usually now believed to have been 7 to 9 feet long. It was held one-handed, with the other hand holding the hoplite's shield. The spearhead was usually a curved leaf shape, while the rear of the spear had a spike called the saurata, which was used to stand the spear in the ground. It was also used as a secondary weapon if the main shaft snapped, or to kill enemies lying on the ground as the formation passed over. This was a common problem, especially for soldiers who were involved with the initial clash with the enemy. Despite the snapping of the spear, hoplites could easily switch to the saurata without great consequence. The rear ranks used the secondary end to finish off fallen opponents as the phalanx advanced over them. Throughout the hoplite era, the standard hoplite's armor went through many cyclical changes. An archaic hoplite typically wore a bronze breastplate, a bronze helmet with cheek plates, as well as greaves and other armor. Later, in the classical period, the breastplate became less common, replaced instead with a corselet that some claim was made of layers of linen glued together, or perhaps of leather, sometimes covered in whole or in part with overlapping metal scales. Eventually even greaves became less commonly used, although degrees of heavier armor remained, as attested by Xenophon as late as 401 BC. These changes reflected the balancing of mobility with protection, especially as cavalry became more prominent in the Peloponnesian War and the need to combat light troops, which were increasingly used to negate the hoplites' role as the primary force in battle. Yet bronze armor remained in some form until the end of the hoplite era. Some archaeologists have pointed out bronze armor does not actually provide as much protection from direct blows as more extensive corselet padding, and have suggested its continued use was a matter of status for those who could afford it. In classical Greek dialect there is no word for swordsman, yet hoplites also carried a short sword called a xiphos. The short sword was a secondary weapon, used if the doru was broken or lost. Samples of the xiphos recovered at excavation sites typically were found to be around 60 centimeters in length. These swords were double-sided and could therefore be used in both the swinging and thrusting motion. These short swords were usually used to slice the enemy's throat during close combat. Hoplites carried a circular shield called a hoplon made from wood and covered in bronze, measuring roughly 1 meter in diameter. It spanned from chin to knee and was very heavy. This medium-sized shield was made possible partly by its dish-like shape, which allowed it to be supported with the rim on the shoulder. This was quite an important feature of the shield, especially for the hoplites that remained in the latter ranks. While these soldiers continued to help press forward, they did not have the added burden of holding up their shield. But the circular shield was not without its disadvantages. Despite its mobility, protective curve, and double straps, the circular shape created gaps in the shield wall at both its top and bottom. These gaps left parts of the hoplite exposed to potentially lethal spear thrusts and were a persistent vulnerability for hoplites controlling the front lines. Phalangite armament. The sarissa was the pike used by the ancient Macedonian army. The actual length of the sarissa is now unknown, but apparently it was twice as long as the doru. This makes it at least 14 feet, but 18 feet appears more likely. By comparison, the great length of the pike was balanced by a counterweight at the rear end, which also functions as a butt spike, allowing the sarissa to be planted into the ground. Because of its great length, weight and differing balance, a sarissa was wielded two-handed. This meant that the aspish was no longer a practical defense. Instead, the phalangites strapped a smaller pelter shield to their left forearm. Although this reduced the shield wall, the extreme length of the spear prevented most enemies from closing, as the pikes of the first 3 to 5 ranks could all be brought to bear in front of the front row. In addition, the last 6 to 18 ranks of soldiers held their spears in the air over the front ranks, making an effective barrier against missiles. This pike had to be held underhand, as the shield would have obscured the soldier's vision had it been held overhead. It would also be very hard to remove a sarissa from anything it stuck in if it were thrust downwards, due to its length.